St. Thomas Aquinas practiced scholasticism. Scholasticism is the translation of ancient Greek philosophy into Latin. It is the study of the ideas and the writing of commentaries or summaries about these ideas, similar to our philosophy journals. These scholastics disputed the ideas in academic forums called disputations, and St. Thomas Aquinas, among others, sought to show kinships and compatibilities between ancient Greek philosophy and Catholic faith. It's of interest to note that after the death of St. Thomas Aquinas in 1274, about 3 years after his death, some ideas of Aristotle, ideas which St. Thomas Aquinas presented in his theology, were condemned by the bishop in Paris, which is where the major university was. So for a period of time, some of the ideas of Aristotle were condemned, and so the study of Aristotle halted. It took about 50 years before that condemnation was revoked. What I would like you to notice as you read the first pages of Folio C is that St. Thomas Aquinas agrees and incorporates ideas taught by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. The first idea on page 3 is the idea of virtue. For Aquinas, as for Aristotle, virtue is a useful way of talking about human goodness, and Aquinas also improves upon the definition of virtue. He identifies a virtue as a kind of habit. In short, a virtue is a good habit. And that term, for me, has been very useful for understanding and talking about virtues. Wisdom, for example, is a kind of habit, and prudence is a kind of habit that we can acquire that enables us to perform our activities well. On page 4 of our readings for this week, St. Thomas Aquinas agrees with Aristotle and much of ancient tradition that the cardinal virtues are key virtues for human life. And this is a really nice statement on page 4 about the cardinal virtues. In fact, comes from a book of disputations focused on the virtues. And there are some useful statements here about human life. Also on this page, St. Thomas Aquinas is shown agreeing with Aristotle that there are 3 main types of human life, or 3 main candidates for the good life. The life of gratification, the political life, and the contemplative life. So he agrees with Aristotle on those points and uses somewhat different terms. So rather than gratification, he uses sensual pleasure. And then instead of using the term political life, he uses the term active life. It is the same concept. The active life or political life is a life of human relationships, the public world, jobs, raising our family, friendships, business, and then of course the contemplative life. So I think you ought to look closely at page 4 for some interesting ideas about the active life. Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that there must be an ultimate end of human life. That's a phrase that Aquinas introduces. Ultimate end is a goal or aim that fulfills our whole life. And like Aristotle, Aquinas thinks there must be such an end in life, or we assume there must be such an end in life. If there weren't such an end fulfilling our lives, we wouldn't call our lives good. In fact, we wouldn't have any aims or goals at all, says Aquinas. Like Aristotle, Aquinas thinks that happiness is the popular term for the ultimate end of human life. Like Aristotle, happiness is something that fulfills all of my wishes. When my life is truly happy, I lack nothing, and happiness is something that can't easily be taken away from me once I've attained it. Like Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas says that people disagree exactly what happiness is or what it consists in. Some say pleasure, some say wealth, some say strength or beauty. And then finally on page 6, like Aristotle, Aquinas identifies contemplating as the key activity in human happiness. And his reasons, again, are similar to Aristotle's. Contemplating is our most important activity. It's our most complex and elaborate thinking activity. And what we contemplate about is the most important being, God. Like Aristotle, Aquinas gives arguments here on page 6 that the contemplative life must be the good life. It must be happiness. And his reasons are reasons you'll find in the Nicomachean Ethics, that contemplating is something we pursue for its own sake, whereas many of the goods of the political life, such as wealth, are pursued for further things. For example, we acquire wealth in order to have a home, and we have a home in order to rest and relax and raise our children, and we raise our children in order to have friendships and lifelong celebrations. Well, contemplating is something that we pursue for its own sake, says Aquinas, and that's exactly what Aristotle has said as well. And then finally, on page 7, Aquinas is shown here identifying wisdom as the most important of the intellectual virtues, or virtues of thought. Here, Aquinas says that wisdom is the leader of all of the intellectual virtues. He doesn't mention an important point that we ought to learn, that wisdom is the virtue of contemplating. So in all these important ways, Aquinas agrees and incorporates the thought of Aristotle. There's one important difference that I would like you to learn, and that is on the topic of imperfect and perfect happiness. For Aristotle, the political life is imperfectly happy because the relationships that we have are vulnerable, they can change overnight. Honor, in other words, my reputation, is something that can change despite my good intentions. So happiness is lost in the political life. It's not truly the happiest life, says Aristotle. Aquinas agrees about that. However, he thinks that the contemplative life is also imperfectly happy. And there's some reasons that he gives on page 6 of our folio C, under the disputation, "Can one be happy in this life?" There are several reasons Aquinas gives to the effect that either the political life or the contemplative life is going to be imperfectly happy. And his view, informed by Catholic faith, is that perfect happiness is in the life to come, in which we can contemplate the nature of God, what he calls the divine essence. That's his term for the nature of God. We can contemplate the nature of God in the life to come indefinitely, for eternity, whereas in this life tragedy, injury, war, pandemic, even the anxiety of the end of life. All of those things interrupt and hinder our contemplations.